because we have many people who can't be with us today. So I wanted to note that we are recording. If you don't want to be on the video, you're welcome to mute your camera at the bottom. But do note, if you have anyone that really wanted to be here today and couldn't for whatever reason, that we'll upload these images upload this video, within about 48 hours onto our YouTube channel. And I'll also share a link with that at the end of the program. Other than that, I think if you have any questions about Zoom or PAFA programs, feel free to message me directly in the chat. I'm here for that. But it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Kate Samworth studied painting at the New Orleans Academy of Fine Art and earned a BFA from PAFA with a major in printmaking. She was awarded the Richard von Hess Travel Scholarship, which she used to travel to Spain and Turkey, where she volunteered on organic farms for 6 months. She's exhibited across the US and abroad and is currently illustrating her 4th book. We are so excited to have PAFA alum and successful artist and illustrator here with us today. Welcome, Kate. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I really had a great experience at PAFA, and I'm always happy to come back there, even if it's virtually. And thank you all for joining today. I'm going to jump in and share some of my work with you. I'm going to show some work that I feel sort of embarrassed about at this point because it's so old and I don't think it aged well. And I'm going to share work that I feel better about. So I think it's important to recognize that we don't always love what we did in our early career, but I'm going to share it with you anyway so that you can get a sense of how my work has changed over time. And I wanted to explain where I'm coming from and how my work has evolved. Even though it's always been inspired by nature, it's changed quite a bit. And I like to really switch media very often. So the media that I use really depends on the mood that I'm trying to create. And when I was in New Orleans, I was studying oil painting. And when I came to PAFA, I was a print major because I'd already been through an oil painting program based on life studies. And I became very curious about printmaking. And when I first moved to Philadelphia, I started off in the continuing education department as a printmaker and decided to come back and get my bachelor's degree because the New Orleans Academy didn't offer a degree. It was just an atelier like the Norman Shanks type program. In fact, the New Orleans Academy was founded by a PAFA alum that graduated in the late 60s and moved down to New Orleans to open his own art academy. And so he was really an important, he's still alive, but he just retired. He founded this fantastic program of life drawing and life painting. They eventually expanded to include sculpture and photography, and now they have ceramics. But it was all observational painting. And so I will share now some of this early work. So these are pieces I did while I was studying at the New Orleans Academy. I grew up in the suburbs of DC, and I used to go down to the National Portrait Gallery, and I really loved looking at the portrait paintings that were really realistic because I felt like I could have a conversation almost like they do in Scooby-Doo, where the portrait seems to be alive. And I love standing in front of those portraits and imagining that I was communicating with somebody from some other realm. So I really was interested in learning to paint realistically because I wanted to create these worlds that came out of my imagination. So when I was studying still life painting in New Orleans, I was trying to figure out how to make those still lifes personal and how to put story into them. So I did this series of paper figures so that I could sort of create narratives with them. But I saw these as experiments, and I wasn't really sure what my artistic voice was. Now, wouldn't you know, it went fine when we did our test, but now I'm not able to flip the image with the arrow, so bear with me for a sec. There we go. So what it took was for me to leave the New Orleans Academy and take a trip to Brazil. I'd been studying Portuguese, with a Brazilian woman in New Orleans. There was a pretty big community of expats from Brazil, and they put on these fantastic parades during Mardi Gras, and they had samba schools and dancing, and I was really interested in Brazilian culture. And so I took a trip down to Brazil, and I ended up in this national park. And I had planned to just stay there for the weekend. I had spent a week with a friend from New Orleans who was studying Portuguese in a city nearby. And I rode the bus out to this national park, and I met some Brazilians that were looking for another person to go on a hike with them, because they'd hired a guide, and if they could find 10 people, they could get a better price on the guide. So I ended up going on a hike with these people, and he took us out for, this trip was, I think, 3 or 4 days. And we had to carry all our food and water with us, and we walked all that time without seeing anybody else, and we didn't see any billboards. It was really phenomenal. It was so beautiful, so quiet, so peaceful, and I fell in love with bird watching. Even though I hadn't brought binoculars, there were so many birds to see, and also so many insects and humongous butterflies, frogs that were as big as sneakers. It was really a profoundly beautiful experience, and I ended up spending 4 months in this park. The guide wanted a translator because a lot of Europeans would come to this park to hike, and he didn't speak English, so I ended up working as his guide, and we would go on hikes that were about 10 or 11 days long at the longest. So I got to really spend this time outdoors. That was really unusual for me. And I felt this really profound connection to being outside and noticing things, noticing all the different plants and birds and insects. And that started to come into my work. And so while I was staying in that park, I was painting little scenes of the people on my street. All of the roads there were dirt, and the women would sweep the roads. I don't really know why, but they did. They swept the dirt roads. And I loved watching that dust come up. So when I returned to New Orleans, I was trying to figure out how to take this experience of connecting with the environment. And I was very familiar with all these different environmental challenges that we're facing. And I'd read a lot about farming and about how many forests around the world, but particularly in Brazil, were cleared to raise cattle or to raise soybeans. And all of the runoff from the agriculture was going into the waterways and killing off the ecosystems. And so, clearing the land to grow cheap cattle and soybeans is doing a lot of damage. And I really, after being in Brazil, realized what was at stake. And so I was trying to figure out how to address these environmental concerns in my work in a way that felt more general and more fantasy-like, because I didn't want it to be too specific. Even though it sounds very didactic, I was really trying hard to keep some sense of humor and the surreal in there so that I didn't feel like I was telling people how to feel. In my 20s, I felt like it was a good idea to raise awareness, and then I just trusted that people would be curious and do the research on their own and change their ways. And so I was trying to figure out how to address things like deforestation and overdevelopment. Yeah?
I'm sorry to bother you. I just wanted to make sure we can't see your PowerPoint.
Oh.
I just wanted to double check that.
Oh, that's definitely good to know. Sorry, I was just rambling on not knowing that. So I'll go back to...
I thought you were just giving context, and then I'm like, oh, wait, I think we should check.
I'm very glad you told me. So I'll just skim back to, these were the still lifes that I was doing in New Orleans, where I was trying to create some sense of narrative within the still life. And then this is the setting in Brazil where I did all the hiking. This little house in the top left is where I was staying. And then this is just a shot from one of our hikes. Both of these are just shots from that fantastic hike. And then these are the little scenes of the town where I was staying, where people were sweeping the dirt roads. And part of what was so striking about being in that town was that there was one road that came into town, but the rest of the roads were dirt, and there was really nowhere to go inside the park except if you had van that was part of the city's program to take people out to the wilderness, or by foot. And so there weren't cars, and so it was incredibly quiet in this town, and it was really amazing to live in that kind of silence, because it's a very unusual experience. And so this is the image that I was talking about, where I was trying to figure out how to use my connection to the environment and what I'd learned through reading about the environment and create some sort of allegory. And so my early works were all allegorical environmental themes. This is about the control of nature, about GMOs and genetically modified plants and animals, and kind of spoofing the idea that we could shape these topiary bushes into animals and control these animals. So you can see their leashes are actually pretty fragile, and I thought it was funny to try to make pets out of a rhino and an elephant, because it's playing with this idea of thinking we can control nature, and then it just resorts to its natural being and could do a lot of damage. So I'd imagine they'd outgrow their leashes and take off and do some trampling. And then these are inspired by development and expansion and deforestation and water loss. So very heavy themes. And the reason I feel somewhat doubtful about the success of these pieces is that I feel like they're too melodramatic and perhaps too didactic. And so I became aware that that my idea of like trying to raise environmental awareness in this way maybe wasn't that effective, and I started changing the way I approached my work. And so I was working in that style for several years, and we had in the meantime moved from New Orleans to Philadelphia. We moved the year before Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. And so when I was in Philly, I heard about the storm, and I was listening to the coverage in my studio as I was working, and all the phones were jammed, so I couldn't get in touch with my friends. And I knew that most of my friends would have left, but I knew many of them wouldn't be able to leave. And I also know that if you don't get out really early, you can be stuck on the highway and face the brunt of the storm on the highway. So it was a very stressful time. And I felt like the human impact of Hurricane Katrina was too personal for me to address, because I had moved away. I had this sense of survivor's guilt, and I felt like it would be exploitative to try to address the human impact since I had gotten away safely. But I was very moved by an interview that I heard with a couple that had stayed in the city throughout the storm, and they were describing how the day after the birds had flown out of the city, and so the city was perfectly quiet. Like they knew the people would return eventually, and that the water from the broken levee would recede eventually, but they said it was really bizarre not to hear any birds. And so I was thinking about how we just have put our faith that science will find some cure to take care of all the destruction we've done to different habitats, and we use all these pesticides to maintain our crops, that the birds then eat insects poisoned by the insecticides or pesticides. We've really created a mess with the agricultural systems that we've used. So I was thinking about all of these things and about the way we've sort of put off our own responsibility with the sense that science will find a cure. So I developed this catalog thinking, oh, some company will make birds to replace the ones we've lost. And so the idea began with just the cover of a catalog, and then for a few years I experimented with the idea, and I tried to figure out how these birds would be made. So for a while I had a man that was capturing rodents and putting bird costumes on them and raising them from young and teaching them how to fly and sing. And then I kind of took ideas from our different travels around the world and took patterns from other cultures, and I thought, well, maybe he's like this man that has some secretive Victorian house in upstate New York, and he's gathered together a bunch of creative people and scientists, and they're all contributing something different to making these birds. So some people will carve the beaks out of wood, and some will make them out of porcelain, and they'll paint them and so forth, and then they're going to strap them onto these mysteriously made bodies that are genetically modified. And so I had taken inspiration from my readings about Alfred Wallace. And so I changed the name of my, in case you're not familiar with Alfred Wallace, he was a contemporary of Darwin's who was developing the same theories of adaptation and evolution that Darwin was. Only he was lesser known, and he was sending Darwin his writings. And when Darwin saw that they were developing their theories at the same time, he quickly got his theory published first. So he's the more recognized name. But Wallace was studying birds down in the Amazon and was traveling throughout South America gathering species. And so I named the founder of my company after him. And so this is just a glimpse through the catalog of parts. So I imagine the message of the company is that to build a bird the proper way, you'll need more than patience and optimism. You'll also need the right parts. And so they can provide all these parts. And so you would choose the body that you want. And all of these bodies are based on real bird bodies. I was studying all of the stuffed birds at the Wagner Institute of Science. And if you haven't been yet in Philadelphia, you really should go. I don't know if it's open to the public yet again, but it's a museum of a museum. This collector gathered all of those specimens and stuffed them at the turn of the 20th century, and he left the museum as it was when he died. And so it's still got his handwritten calligraphy labels and all of his stuffed birds and drawers full of specimens. It's a really spectacular place. So I spent a lot of time studying the birds over there, and it was important to maintain some grounding in reality to this concept. So I used real bird bodies, and these are all the colors that exist in nature. But then, as you can see, I changed the other parts. I used the shapes from real birds, but I changed the colors so that it would be clear that this was an element of fantasy. And then I gave them different names that I tried to keep in the spirit of the founder of the company, people that he would admire. And then there's an instruction manual that will show you how to build your bird. And teach it to sing and fly, of course. And then, of course, there's a troubleshooting page because things can go wrong when you're making your own birds and introducing them into the wild. And so after I wrote that book, I was really trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. Illustration was something I had always been interested in, but I really wanted to write my own stories, and I hadn't really committed the time needed to writing my own stories. But I began to look at paintings and to look at the stories within paintings that already exist, and to think about the moments before and after the one captured in the painting, and to see what kind of story might be told from what we already know. And so at PAFA, that self-portrait of the artist in his museum painted by Charles Peale was hanging when I was a student there. I know that it's out on loan, and I don't know if it's been returned yet. But when I was a student, I stopped to look at that painting all the time. I found it really strange. He looked like a very serious man. It's a life-size painting, and it's Charles Peale looking down very seriously in a black suit. And then he's got this museum behind him of all his stuffed birds. So I only looked at it because I thought it was so odd and even awkward. But because I was interested in all the natural history collectors of the time, I started to read his biography, and I discovered that he opened the first natural history museum in the US. This was in 1806, so it was still a very brand new country with just a few states. But his intention was to collect and catalog one of every living thing in the US and even beyond the Mississippi. And so he had people He had biologists that were on the Lewis and Clark expedition sending specimen back to him. And one of his sons went out with the Long expedition to gather specimen. And so the notion that he thought he could collect one of every living thing to me was a really exciting idea to try to turn into a story. So I worked on this idea where he would step out of his painting into a museum full of other living paintings, and they'd be able to exit and enter different paintings, and he could gather specimen for his museum. So that gave me the chance to take from some of my favorite artists like De Chirico and Hieronymus Bosch and Grant Wood, and to imagine that these figures could just jump around from one scene to the next. And Peale needed a foil because he was a very serious man. And so I thought that Frida Kahlo would make a really good foil for him, because she was apparently pretty saucy and outspoken and had a real lust for life and was really unstoppable. Even though she spent so much time in bed, she never lost her sense of curiosity and adventure. And she also loved nature. And then I had him also travel with the two girls from Velázquez's painting of Las Meninas. What I found useful about them is that they had those giant farthingales, the hoop skirts, and I thought those hoops that they would prop their skirts up with would make really good traps for animals, so they'd be able to capture animals by using those things that held their skirts up. So they entered the story, and they set about to help Peale find new specimen for his museum. So this is a scene in which they entered Bosch's Garden of Eden and tried to capture some specimen, and then got really scared and ran out on their own. And you can see I've switched media a million times. I kept rewriting the story, changing the media, changing the format, experimenting with it as a play, even as an animated film. I never was fully satisfied, but I really enjoyed the process of exploring the idea. And there's a moment in the story when Frida runs into this self-portrait that she painted of herself as a deer, and that's when she realizes what is happening. She realizes that they're all paintings of themselves inside this museum that have come to life, because until that point, they were enjoying traveling in and out of these worlds, but they couldn't understand how it was that they could do that. And because Peale was friends with Benjamin Franklin, and he was part of the Philosophical Society, which was a group of scientists in the early 1800s, late 1700s, in the story, he's just thinking, well, I'll just do all this traveling now, and when I get back to Philadelphia, I can present all of my findings to Franklin and the Philosophical Society, and they'll be able to explain why it is that I can travel in and out of these windows. So Frida realizes that they're all paintings of themselves, and she goes back to break the news to Peale, and she thinks that he's going to be really excited, but then he realizes that his mission will never be truly accomplished because he's only a painting. And so he has an existential crisis, and he's going to enter that Mark Rothko painting behind him and just float around while he tries to figure out what he's going to do now that his main mission in life has been aborted. And this is a still from when I tried to turn it into a stop motion animated film. I worked on the film for about 80 hours and got about 2 minutes of footage, and at that point I decided that I had better really make sure I knew what story I was telling, because it was going to be a very time-consuming project. So that is one of the unfinished projects of my life. And this is another still where Frida's entered Rousseau's dream. So then comes the last election. And if you think this election is even more tense. But in the months leading up to the last election, I was really struggling to remain optimistic and to negotiate these friendships that I have with people who don't share my values. And so I was finding it really hard to make art and to focus. And I decided to really think about what it is that connects us all. And I felt like the easiest way to tap into that sense of connection was through animals. So I started painting a lot of animals that are just enjoying each other's company through music. Um, I love connecting to people through music because you don't have to understand the words. There don't need to be any words, but you can share this passion just for the sounds. And so music started to emerge as a recurring theme. And also, I played in a band in the 80s, a pretty terrible punk band, but we did get to go on tour in Europe a couple times. And we played a lot of shows in countries where we didn't speak the same language. And yet, we did have this really exciting moment of a shared experience with the audience, even if they couldn't understand what the singer was singing about. And so, music turns up a lot. And just this sense of connecting, of sharing joy and grief. And also I started to show animals that have taken back human structures. And so these are polar bears that have found an abandoned hunting lodge, and they found some detritus left behind by humans. And they're connecting through the instruments and dancing and things that they've learned from humans. And this piece is called All We Need Is Here. And again, a reference to consumption and how in America you can walk around the streets and find enough furniture for your whole apartment. And these raccoons are really enjoying all the goodies that they've found and planning a party. This is called An Explosion of Peace, and the doves are a symbol of peace. So I like to imagine that I'm injecting these images of optimism into this steady stream of imagery that affects our collective consciousness. So I decided it was really important to start putting some positive, happy images out there. And then I began to be really more interested in a group of people that would feel this connection with nature, that protect it. And I started really reading a lot of fairy tales and just trying to explore these ideas of this group of people that are living off the woods and bringing nature back into the house. And it was a chance to just play with some fantastic imagery. I really enjoy looking at architecture and adding elements of architecture into my work, and just trying to create a sense of joy and mystery and fun. And this was inspired by the second line parades in New Orleans that are held after a funeral, or they're part of the funeral procession. When I was living in New Orleans, I saw a lot of these parades where when a person dies, everyone gathers at the church for a service, and then they carry the coffin back to the person's house, and then they have a parade where they go to the person's haunt. So they'll go around the neighborhood, stop at all their favorite bars, stop at their friends' houses, stop at their relatives' houses, and it's a marching band followed by all of their friends. And it's as much a celebration of life as it is a mourning of their passing. And so I found it a really powerful way to think about all of the changes that we're going through in this country right now, and to try to find some joy in all of this madness. And this piece is in scratchboard. I really love scratchboard because of my history as a printmaker at PAFA. This is a black ink laid on top of a white clay surface, and you scratch away the ink with a needle to reveal the white underneath, and it feels very much like etching, and you can get those really nice detailed lines that you get in etchings. And it was inspired by the dinners that my friends and I used to have in New Orleans, where we'd haul all of our, we'd haul a picnic table and china and candles and everything over to Audubon Park and set up under a willow tree where the branches reached down to the ground, and we'd have these wonderful dinner parties hidden entirely by this tree. And so it was a lot of fun to just draw on these great memories and life experiences. And this is a piece of the animals taking control of their habitat. Again, they've found tools left behind by humans, and this piece is called Organizing, and they've got plans. I don't know exactly what their plans are. I don't know if they're going to build an ark and set off for a new territory, or if they're just going to rebuild the habitat that they've been left. But I'd like to think that nature will triumph despite our best efforts, and this is another exploration on that theme. What I would leave all aspiring artists with is an assignment that Ron Wyffels gave to my drawing class. He, in case you don't know him, he's the lithography teacher at PAFA, and he also teaches drawing. And one day he gave us the assignment to do the worst drawing that we possibly could. And it was the most liberating experience ever because you no longer had to worry about making mistakes. And so the thing I try to get my students to do is to allow themselves to make mistakes, because that's the only way to really develop as an artist, is to do some horrible work that you feel embarrassed by later. And so I created this totally bizarre image of these human deer, some sort of bestiary creatures that realize what they've done to the forest, and they're in a panic, and they are trying to escape the forest. So what I ask you to do tonight is a terrible drawing.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Kate.
You're welcome.
That's wonderful. Just to reiterate too, we have time for questions, and so feel free to drop things in the chat, or if you'd like to virtually raise your hand, you can just click on the participant button and it'll say raise hand, or just wave us down, or put it in the chat if you'd like to ask us something. So we have a great question from Dory already, referencing the last thing you mentioned, asking anyone in particular you're referencing in the awful drawing.
Dory, do you mean, am I drawing upon another artist's work? I'm not sure. Awful people. No, that awful drawing was just that I thought that the human heads on the beasts ended up looking ugly. So to me, it was an experiment. And in the end, I'm like, oh, I think this is not a very good drawing. It looks weird. It looked a lot weirder than I meant for it to. And the faces looked more monstery than I had intended. So that's what I mean by awful, is I just thought, I'm just going to put these human heads on these deer and see if it looks good or bad. And I think it looks bad, but I think it's emotionally powerful. So that's what I mean.
Thanks for that question, Dory. I'm going to ask Katie's question in a second, but I'd love, Kirsten, I see your hand. I'd love to hear from you.
Okay. Yeah, my question is a potential person who would attend your class. I do instruct, but I also am the forever student. What would you say to us, whether we're just not experienced at all or make a profession at it like myself? Would you like us to get out of either class? And I'm basically asking you for the elevator pitch for both classes, or the condensed version of why it's really important that I connect with you in these classes, because I think I need to, but I just want to hear your perspective on it.
All right. So this is sort of along the lines of doing the awful drawing. The illustration class, I really want people, first of all, I love illustrated books so much, and I've discovered that there are tons of beautiful illustrated books that aren't just for children. And so sometimes they look like children's books, but they're so deep. And also, because I've gotten into this business of illustration in the last several years, I've realized that a simple picture book is incredibly difficult to write, and that it's a very profound thing. And so the point of the class is first to turn people on to how fantastic some of these picture books are that look very simple and breezy, and how deep the subject matter is, and how these are really like fuller artistic expressions than a single painting, and that we really shouldn't dismiss them as books for people that don't have the deep understanding that we have as adults, because there's so much great stuff out there. The purpose of this class is to experiment and improvise, because I teach a lot of illustration courses where people come either with their own story idea, or I assign them one and they have to create a finished storyboard. But this class is really about improvising, experimenting, figuring out how stories are told, figuring out what stories you want to tell, finding your voice, learning how to take chances, learning how to come up with some ideas and pursue them for a while and figure out if it's something that really has potential to be the story that you want to tell. And it's really just a great chance to do some improv. A lot of us have this fear that we're going to do something that doesn't look good, so we don't want to do it. And so my purpose in teaching is just experiment, allow yourself to make mistakes, share those mistakes, because there's usually something really honest in those mistakes that can be shaped up. But the only way to be creative is to experiment and to allow yourself to fail and to not expect everything to be perfect and finished. And so I'm teaching this class with a friend of mine who I've known since I was 15, and she was the first committed writer that I ever knew. She has written several middle grade readers, and her parents are both writers. And in fact, her father is the New York Times reporter that first broke the story on Frank Serpico, and his name is David Burnham. But Molly Burnham has written several books, and she's a really committed writer. And I always wanted to bring in this element of the writing portion that could be taught by someone who really knows the material to go along with the illustration portion. So the class is an experimental class, and it's not about the finished product, just developing your ideas. I saw somebody asking what the size of my work is. They tend to be around 9 by 12. I really like to work small. For one thing, I love tiny little details. And another practical concern is bigger work is expensive to frame and hard to store. So I think I figured that out early in my career and thought, why go big when I can just work small? And a little bit of my interest in working small is sort of fighting against the abstract expressionists who think that working 5 by 6 makes it really noteworthy. And I thought, oh, what if it's 5 by 6 inches? Like try to compete with that just by trying to draw people in. So it's all personal preference, but I like small.
Thanks. That was going to be my next question. We have another one in the chat from Gwen, and I might ask Gwen if you don't mind either expanding on this or I'll just say it and then we can see. But
it seemed that her early memory began at the portrait gallery, and I was just wondering if there was a particular painting or genre of painting that really influenced her thinking about being an artist.
100%. I really love Romaine Brooks. Do you know Romaine Brooks?
No.
From the 20s. I don't know if I can look her up real quick and share, but I really love Romaine Brooks. I really love Alice Neal.
Yes.
And then I really loved all of the realistic portraits that I don't remember. The portrait gallery has a huge collection of portraits. I'm not familiar with all of the artists, but I loved the really realistic oil paintings because they seemed so alive. I loved Alice Neal and Romaine Brooks for their expression, and I felt like that skill set was a little more something I could accomplish in my lifetime.
Did you realize you had the gift of art when you were looking at these paintings?
Well, my mom's a painter, and she had us doing art, or especially me, ever since I was a kid. So I was always interested in art, but I didn't have any skills then. And I really wanted to learn how to draw realistically. And I went to the Corcoran for 1 year in 1985. And the teachers would just give us some weird assignment and then go smoke and come back 3 weeks later and have us talk about it. So, I mean, I don't know what they were doing. Maybe they were smoking, but they weren't giving us any instruction. And so, no, when I was going to the museums, I was trying to figure it out. I did a lot of copying And then I went to New Orleans and discovered the New Orleans Academy. And so that was actually, my mom was visiting me in New Orleans, and she was the one that discovered it. I'd just been living there for a couple of months, and she took a walk and passed by it, and they were having a student exhibit. And so she came home and told me, oh, I found the school that you're looking for. And so that was a stroke of luck.
That's wonderful. Sounds like a wonderful mom.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gwen. Okay, so we just have a few more minutes if folks would like to put more questions in the chat or ask a question. And I have one while we wait for more folks, if that's all right.
All right.
I'm curious as a working artist also how, I know we've been now in quarantine for 6 months, but if you've felt the impact of COVID on your studio practice, and if you had, I love kind of the ways you talk about positivity, if you have any advice for people who might be struggling with their production right now or getting back into how to balance things.
It took me months. It was really a few months. Luckily, I guess, I have a deadline. So I had written a book back before the last election and illustrated. It's a wordless picture book, so it's a story told in pictures. But I completed it before the last election. Then we shopped it around, and I finally got a publisher. And so now I have to finish this book that I wrote all in pencil. Now I have to do it again in color, and that was 4 very different years ago. So it's been really strange to try to reconnect with the story when so much has changed. But honestly, I took inspiration from the writer George Sanders. I don't know if you all are familiar with George Sanders. He writes really brilliant short stories, and he has 1 novel out. He's a contemporary writer. But I heard an interview with him, and he's like, it doesn't matter what you do now, just keep making the work, because we're going to record this moment for our grandchildren. So it doesn't have to be good, and you don't have to feel great about the work. Just do the work, because your grandkids are going to be curious about this epic, and you'll have this to show them. So I found that incredibly useful. And now is a good time to experiment. I'd say now is your time to just go out there and allow yourself to make mistakes and listen to music instead of the news. Listen to some Beethoven.
That's great advice. Thank you, Kate.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful to think about it as something to share with our grand.
Yeah, future generations will wonder how we got through it, and will say, oh, I did these horrible doodles. Audrey has a question.
Oh, yes. Sorry, is your hand, or Audrey, go ahead. Or is it do you see something in the chat?
I saw her raise her hand.
Oh. Thanks.
There we go. I just wanted to say that in a completely different slant on what you're doing, which I think is so remarkable, I am part of a group here in New Jersey called Bookmates, and we are paired with children who are having trouble learning to read, one-on-one for a half hour. And they become like your own children. It's so wonderful. My grandchildren, my great-grandchildren. Anyway, I often choose books for them that have no words.
Oh, wonderful.
And I do allow them to make up their own stories. And it becomes such an awakening for them to be able to read the pictures.
Yes.
They feel like they're really doing something creative.
Yes.
And I can't say enough about how much what I saw today from you was an inspiration.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm very excited to hear that you're bringing them wordless picture books, because it is so fun.
Not always, but because they have to be exposed to the writing. But but what happens on those days when the books have no words is just phenomenal.
And it is important to be able to interpret images and to have that creative outlet. That's very valuable.
Thank you.
And there's lots of wonderful wordless books out there. I think I see a question from Joan Samworth, a relative. This is my mother, Joan, who's the artist who lives down the street from me.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to make a comment. Kate's always had an incredible sense of humor that sometimes my stomach would hurt just from her, telling me a story. But I remember before she even started art school, she went across country with a friend and they stopped at the Grand Canyon, and she came back and she said, Mom, I did this amazing painting of the Grand Canyon. And I said, no kidding. And I thought, how complicated that is. I said, I can't wait to see it. And it's these two figures with big bellies and hats and bright shirts and cameras hanging around their neck. And she said everybody that she saw would pop out of their car, take a photo, and get back in the car. But anyway.
That's funny. I didn't remember that. I thought that was a painting of the Grand Canyon, but the people I saw there instead.
Right. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that story. I love connections over Zoom. We have a question from Ellen asking or complimenting your work, and then also asking how you plan out an illustration such as bears.
Oh, okay. I do a ton of pencil sketches. I do them in perspective, and I do many, many sketches before I settle on the finished piece. A lot of times I won't be fully satisfied with the first version, so then I'll do another, or I'll think, oh, well, here's the moment when the bear is meeting the woman, so maybe later it's when they're dancing. So I like to work in series, because even if it doesn't develop into a complete story, I like to at least have a few interactions. And then sometimes that's where my ideas come from, is I'll do a few images and then I'll start to think about the worlds they inhabit and where else can I take this. So I like to explore one idea from many angles.
I was wondering if you could speak to collaboration, because I've noticed that you're collaborating on this class with someone you've said you've known since you were 15, and I know you also collaborated on a book project with another wonderful writer. And
Lulu Miller is a radio host on NPR. She's now on, I think I'm allowed to say, well, she was working on Radiolab and then Invisibilia, and she's a science reporter for NPR, and she wrote this book. And I met her in New Orleans, and we became fast friends, and she asked me to illustrate it. So I illustrated this nonfiction. It's part biography, part her memoir woven together with the biography of a 19th century ichthyologist who studies fish. And so she and I have collaborated on a couple other magazine pieces, and we have other ideas that we're working on. I love collaborating with writers, because even though I love writing, I just don't put in the time that's needed to be good at it, because I put all that time into the studio. So I love it when I find a like-minded individual with the same sense of dark humor and an interest in nature and natural history. And so she's been a really fantastic person to collaborate with. And I've also always had a fantasy of, like, in my next life coming back as like a sketch comedy writer for a show like 30 Rock or something. So I love playing writing games with my friends. I love the interaction, and the studio process can be so isolating that I really enjoy the chance to collaborate with people.
That's great to know, because I think collaborating can be such an invigorating part of being an artist and getting out of the studio, but there can also be a hard balance of making sure, I think, both perspectives are, or finding the right partner, it sounds like it's important.
Definitely. And sometimes you have to figure out how to listen to the other person's ideas and use them, but also keep your own sensibilities and aesthetic. And so that was, thankfully, Lulu and I did have some moments where she had really strong feelings about how one of the chapters should be illustrated, and I had to work with what she was suggesting. And she's really easy to talk to, and so we have a really nice friendship, and it was very easy to communicate with her. But you really do have to find that way of pushing back gently, being open to ideas, and recognizing when is it just your ego saying, no, I don't want your ideas, versus maybe it actually is a good idea, but I didn't think of it, so let me see how I can make it my own. So it can be complicated. I see Gwen has a question.
Yeah. Yeah, so Gwen was asking if you start, I think with like your reference material. So do you start with a photograph when you can't study in person, or where are these images coming from?
So I do a ton of drawing in the Natural History Museum whenever possible. I go to the zoos and draw. I do figure studies. And then, of course, I need photographic references for the animals, because even at the zoo, they're just quick studies. So what I'll try to do is I'll settle on the position of the animal, the way I need it to behave in the picture, and then I'll use multiple photographic references to figure out what the shape of the skull is, for example. I have tons of books on animal drawing, so they all have slightly different turn of the head. It's helpful to have tons of resources, because if you're trying to copy from a photo, chances are the person taking the picture doesn't have the eye level that you need. So you've got to be able to figure out how to set it up in perspective, put it in the position you want, and then use the photos to fill in that missing information. And I also have a very nice, I'm going to grab one and show you. It's my favorite toy. Hang on. I have a couple of these models from a German toy company, and they have a whole line of animals, and they're extremely useful models, because then you can turn the heads to all different angles, and you can cast a light on it and see what the shadows are, and you can make them talk to each other.
Those are wonderful. Yeah, that's great. I can see where the stop animation kind of,
yes,
where that had come in.
One of the first things that I saw as a teenager that made me want to be an artist is the Quay brothers, who it turns out they're from the main line. So the Quay brothers make these bizarre stop motion films that look like they're set in Eastern Europe. Some of them are about Eastern Europe. And they are both graduates of University of the Arts. So I saw their movies when I was a teenager, and I thought, oh, that's what I want to do. So I've always had an interest in stop motion, but it's so time consuming that I haven't finished anything.
Maybe if you had a twin, because that's
exactly.
Speaking, they're like, yes, we spend all our time together, we make art, we sleep.
Exactly. Exactly.
Thanks. Well, I don't think if we have any other questions, we'll give it just a second. But I think that's a lovely way to kind of to sign off today's program.
Thank you all. I see some friendly faces that I know from the PAFA days. It's really nice to have all of you here. Mm-hmm. And I hope to see you in class someday. Or perhaps out on the street like wild animals. Even better.
One can hope. Or hopefully someday, we can we'll have events and gatherings in person.
That's right, group hugs.
I did, of course, want to mention that although we aren't, all of our events are going to be online still for safety. Our museum is opening this week. So I'm going to drop a quick link to that in the chat. We are so excited. You can't maybe see us, we can't gather, but you can come and see art in real life, which I know some of us have missed immensely. I'll put more information on that. But thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Kate, for sharing your work. I'll let you have the kind of final goodbye.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Stay safe. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hi, Mia. Here. Hi. Feel free to unmute and say goodbye on the way out too. We love to hear you. So. Thank you all.
Oh, Mia. Hi, Mia. I didn't even see you there.
Hey, thank you. I was eating for
Hi.
so my cameras, it was wonderful to see you.
You
and
too.
Congratulations on all your success.
Thank you. It's been great to see your drawings on Instagram. It's nice to see you.
Oh, thank you. Have a good afternoon.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Abby. Hi, Robert.
Bye.